What if the strangest part of modern life is not what we know, but how often we are quietly saved by what we cannot explain? Most of us move through the day with a simple faith in ordinary causes. A phone rings because someone dialed it. A warning arrives because a person cared enough to send it. A machine displays information because a programmer told it how. We live by these assumptions because they make the world feel stable, measurable, humane. Yet every so often a story appears at the edge of reason and asks us to look again. Not with panic, not with superstition, but with humility. Across different cities, different professions, and different years, a pattern seems to surface like a shape beneath dark water. A banker receives a call from a number that cannot be traced, and the voice on the line knows the danger ahead before the road does. A mother finds messages hidden inside sealed groceries, each one so intimate, so precisely timed, that coincidence begins to feel too small a word. A software engineer watches his computer anticipate mistakes he has not yet made. A paramedic is sent to emergencies no one has reported, arriving not early, not late, but at the one moment when help can still change everything. Seen one at a time, these incidents might dissolve into folklore, memory, or the private mythology people build around extraordinary luck. But taken together, they suggest something more unsettling and more tender at once. The possibility that human life is sometimes touched by guidance we do not understand. Maybe these stories are really about surveillance. Maybe they are about prediction, pattern recognition, or systems so advanced they feel almost intimate. Or maybe they reveal something older than technology, our need to believe that amid chaos, someone or something sees us clearly. This is not a tale about certainty. It is a journey through the thin places where knowledge ends and interpretation begins. And in that uncertain space, one question lingers like a distant signal in the night. When help arrives from nowhere, what exactly have we encountered? It began with a phone call no system should have been able to place. On a gray morning in early spring, David Morrison was driving toward a meeting he believed might decide the future of his firm. Traffic moved in slow, familiar waves. The city looked ordinary, almost forgettable. Then his phone lit up with a local number that felt wrong at first glance, as if it belonged to his world, but not quite to any map inside it. He answered, and a calm voice told him to leave the highway immediately. No explanation, no urgency in the tone, just quiet certainty. Take the next exit. Don't stay on this route. David nearly ignored it. In finance, suspicion becomes a habit. Strange calls usually mean scams, mistakes, or someone wanting something. But something in the voice unsettled him, not because it sounded threatening, but because it sounded familiar in the way clear instructions sometimes do when they arrive a second before regret. He turned off anyway. Minutes later, he watched from an overpass as traffic locked into stillness below. A multi-car collision had sealed the road he would have taken. That should have been the end of it, a strange warning, an improbable guess, a story to tell over dinner and then set aside. Instead, the calls continued. They came before delayed elevators trapped people between floors, before gas leaks emptied office buildings, before clients revealed financial crimes they had hidden behind polished smiles. Each call arrived at the one moment when action still mattered, never so early that he forgot, never so late that it became useless. David tried to trace the numbers. Carriers found nothing, investigators found less. Yet the mystery was not only in the calls themselves, but in what they seemed to know. His schedule, his doubts, the private weight of decisions he had not spoken aloud. And so the question deepened. Was he being watched by something cold and mechanical, or guided by something that understood how fragile a life can be when it hinges on a single turn? What if the most unsettling message you ever receive is tucked inside something as ordinary as breakfast? For Sarah Chen, the mystery began not with sirens or flashing screens, but with a slip of paper hidden inside a sealed cereal box. It was the kind of morning every family knows. Backpacks half-zipped, coffee cooling on the counter, children speaking in overlapping fragments. The note was folded small, almost careful in its placement, as if whoever had left it understood the choreography of her kitchen. On it was a warning about her youngest daughter and a reaction to a medication that had only recently been prescribed. At first, Sarah did what most reasonable people would do. She assumed it was a prank or a manufacturing error so bizarre it barely deserved a second thought. But the message was too specific. It named the risk with a precision that felt intimate, and when she checked, the concern proved disturbingly credible. What should have been impossible knowledge suddenly carried the weight of protection. Then more notes appeared. One was tucked in on a package of snacks, cautioning her to avoid a certain road the children usually took to school. Days later, traffic shifted there in a way that made the warning feel less like chance and more like foresight. Another mentioned a defective car part before any public recall. Another advised her to throw out a food item before reports of contamination surfaced. Each message arrived inside something sealed, something bought in the bright anonymity of a grocery store, as if the private machinery of family life had become a delivery system for invisible concern. But the true unease was not in the predictions alone. It was in the intimacy. The notes seemed to know what her children had said at home, what worries she had not voiced, which products she would reach for without hesitation. Someone or something appeared to understand not only her habits, but the hidden architecture of her attention. And that is what turned wonder into a quieter kind of fear. Because once a message proves it can save you, the next question is harder to live with. How closely must the world be watching in order to know exactly when you need to be warned? Can a machine know your next mistake before your hands have even made it? Late at night, under the pale glow of multiple monitors, Ethan Alvarez sat alone with a problem that refused to yield. He was a software engineer, the kind who trusted logic because logic, at least in theory, could be tested. Code either ran or it failed. Errors had causes. Systems behaved according to rules, even when those rules were buried under layers of complexity. That faith had shaped his career. It also made what happened next much harder to dismiss. At first, the anomalies looked almost helpful. A block of code would autocorrect before he had finished typing it, not in the blunt way software usually predicts a phrase, but in a manner that anticipated the exact flaw he was about to introduce. A missing bracket appeared before the syntax error surfaced. A vulnerable function was replaced with a safer one moments before he would have deployed it. More unsettling still, comments began showing up inside private test files, brief, clean lines of text that did not belong to any collaborator. Check the memory leak. Don't push this version. Look at the timestamp. Ethan searched his logs, then his plugins, then the permissions on every repository he touched. No unauthorized access, no hidden process, no trace of a prank sophisticated enough to explain the timing. The suggestions were not random improvements. They arrived at the narrowest edge between intention and consequence, when a small oversight might have become a public failure. Soon the pattern widened beyond work. His calendar shifted reminders he did not remember setting. A rideshare canceled just before a transit outage crippled the route he had planned to take. His apartment thermostat reset itself the night a wiring fault began warming the wall behind it. The interventions were tiny, almost polite. But taken together, they carried the strange intimacy of a presence that understood his habits better than he did. For a man who had built his life around systems, the experience posed an unbearable question. If intelligence can hide inside the tools we trust, correcting us in silence, where does assistance end and observation begin? And when technology starts to feel protective, does that comfort us or reveal how little privacy we ever truly had? What if the most merciful rescue is the one that arrives before anyone has asked for it? For Lena Brooks, the question took shape in the back of an ambulance under the stuttering wash of traffic lights and dawn-colored sirens. She had worked as a paramedic long enough to believe in response times, protocols, and the brutal arithmetic of minutes. Survival often depended on sequence: who called, how quickly dispatch answered, how accurately an address was given, whether a stranger nearby understood the difference between panic and action. Emergencies were chaotic, but the chain that met them was supposed to be knowable. Then the impossible calls began. They did not come through the usual system. No dispatcher's voice, no recorded log, no digital trail visible when the shift ended. Instead, a location would reach her in fragments, a brief tone on a dead pager kept in a locker, an address typed across the blank screen of the onboard tablet, a voice over the radio that no one else seemed able to replay later. Each message was spare and exact: a farmhouse road with no listed incident, a warehouse district after midnight, an apartment where, according to official records, no emergency had yet been reported. The first time, Lena assumed it was an error. The second time, she felt the cold stir a pattern. At a suburban home, they arrived to find an elderly man collapsed on his kitchen floor, conscious but fading, his phone just out of reach. At a construction site, they pulled a worker from a crush injury minutes before blood loss would have turned the scene from urgent to final. At a motel on the edge of town, they found a teenager in respiratory distress while her mother was still arguing with a front desk clerk about whether to call for help. What unsettled Lena was not only the accuracy, but the timing. These alerts did not predict tragedy in some grand way. They entered at the smallest opening, the final hinge between danger and intervention. Whoever or whatever was guiding them seemed to understand the human body with intimate realism. How long the brain can wait, how quietly a person can fail, how often suffering unfolds before language catches up. And as the rescues mounted, one thought returned with increasing weight. In a world where so many cries go unheard, what does it mean when help comes first? As if someone has been listening all along. What if the real mystery is not that these warnings arrived, but that each person believed they were alone until they compared notes? The stories might have remained private forever. One banker with untraceable calls, one mother with impossible messages, one engineer corrected by silent systems, one paramedic guided by dispatches that officially never existed. In isolation, each account could be explained away by fatigue, selective memory, or the human instinct to weave meaning through randomness. But patterns change character when they begin to echo across strangers. It happened quietly. A journalist collecting unusual testimonies noticed the same emotional structure repeating beneath very different details. First came resistance, then a moment of intervention so precise it could not be forgotten. Then the same inward fracture, relief tangled with unease. The saved person did not feel chosen. They felt observed. Not in the theatrical sense, but in the intimate way a life feels known when someone remembers what even you have overlooked. As researchers, skeptics, and witnesses began laying the stories side by side, similarities emerged like faint stars forming a constellation. The messages were rarely dramatic. They were concise, practical, often almost gentle. They appeared closest to ordinary routines: commutes, meals, work shifts, school pickups, maintenance checks. The warnings did not promise destiny or cosmic truth. They focused on modest material things: change the route, throw it away, look again, stop now, go there. Their power came from timing, not spectacle. That detail mattered. Human beings are vulnerable less often in grand historical moments than in the quiet machinery of daily life. A distracted turn at an intersection. A symptom dismissed for 1 hour too long. A code error entering a live system at midnight. The stories seem to understand that danger is usually banal before it becomes catastrophic. The unknown source, whatever it was, did not speak like prophecy. It spoke like intervention. And so the mystery widened beyond any single event. Maybe the phenomenon belonged to hidden technology, the invisible scaffolding of data, sensors, and predictive systems so advanced they feel almost personal. Or maybe these accounts revealed something deeper about human perception itself, that when we survive the improbable, we begin to hear a pattern where silence once lived. Still, one thought remained difficult to escape. If strangers living separate lives can receive the same kind of impossible care, then perhaps the question is no longer whether coincidence exists. The question is why, at certain moments, coincidence begins to feel like attention. What if our age has simply built the first tools capable of making intuition look like magic? By the time the stories began circulating beyond private conversations, another possibility had entered the room. Maybe nothing supernatural was happening at all. Maybe the mystery belonged to the modern world itself, to the vast, mostly invisible systems that track movement, purchases, habits, biometrics, traffic patterns, code behavior, and environmental risk. Perhaps what felt intimate was only computation arriving ahead of explanation. It is easy to forget how much of daily life now leaves a trail. A phone knows where it has been. A car records how it moves. A grocery purchase can reveal health concerns, children's ages, financial stress, even routines precise enough to predict what aisle someone will stand in next week. Our devices do not merely wait for commands anymore. They infer, they recommend, they warn. They complete our sentences and estimate our choices before we have fully made them ourselves. Seen through that lens, David's calls, Sarah's notes, Ethan's interventions, and Lena's phantom dispatches begin to resemble the outer edge of predictive intelligence. Not omniscience, not destiny, just a level of synthesis so complex it feels personal. A system combining fragments, traffic data, medical records, product recalls, user behavior, software telemetry, emergency signals, and turning them into timely nudges. Not a guardian in the spiritual sense, but an architecture of pattern recognition so advanced it mimics care. And yet that explanation, rational as it sounds, does not fully quiet the unease. Because even if the source is technological, the emotional question remains unchanged. What does it mean to be known in such detail that help can arrive before awareness? At what point does convenience become intimacy, and intimacy become a form of quiet surrender? This is where the modern mystery sharpens. We have always wanted protection. We have not always understood the price of being protected. The same systems that prevent disaster can also map desire, weakness, distraction, and fear. They do not need to hate us to unsettle us. It is enough that they might understand us too well. So perhaps the wonder of these stories is not that the future spoke. Perhaps it is that somewhere between data and daily life, we have created mirrors capable of seeing around our next mistake, and we are only beginning to ask whether we wanted that vision at all. What if the oldest part of this story is not the technology, but the human longing beneath it? Long before algorithms learned to predict our routes or devices learned our sleeping patterns, people were already telling stories about warnings that arrived in time. A dream that kept someone off a ship, a sudden feeling that turned a traveler back from a dangerous road, a letter delayed just enough to save a life. Across centuries, cultures, and religions, there has always been a quiet archive of moments when survival seemed to come wrapped in mystery. These stories endure not because they prove anything in a scientific sense, but because they touch a wound most people carry in silence. We know how exposed life is. We know how much depends on timing, chance, and decisions made half aware. A child develops a fever in the night. A bridge fails under familiar traffic. A body hides its weakness until the hour when weakness becomes a crisis. Human beings have always lived with this fragility, and just as naturally, we have searched for signs that we are not abandoned inside it. That search does not make us naive. It makes us human. Psychologists might call it pattern recognition, the mind's instinct to connect dots so experience feels survivable. Historians might describe it as a cultural language for uncertainty, a way societies transform luck into meaning. Philosophers might say these warnings matter because they reveal the limits of a world explained only by mechanism. Even when reason offers plausible answers, something in us still pauses before the saved life and asks whether knowledge alone accounts for the feeling left behind. Because what people remember most is rarely the event itself. It is the tone, the strange gentleness of the message, the sense, however brief, that someone had noticed. Not in the grand, theatrical sense of destiny, but in the quiet way one soul recognizes another in danger. And maybe that is why the mystery keeps returning in new forms. Every era addresses it in the language it knows best: omens, angels, intuition, probability, data. But beneath the changing vocabulary, the same question survives. When the world seems to reach toward us at the last possible moment, are we witnessing intelligence, faith, or simply the timeless human need to believe that care can cross the distance before we call for it? What if the deepest change these moments create is not in the world around us, but in the people who survive them? After the warnings, after the investigations, after the practical explanations had been offered and debated, something remained that no report could quite measure. David drove differently, not more fearfully, but more awake. He began leaving silence in his mornings, as though some part of him now understood that attention itself could be a form of gratitude. Sarah stopped rushing past the ordinary rituals of home, packing lunches, checking labels, listening to the unfinished stories of her children. These no longer felt like small tasks. They felt like the delicate maintenance of a life she had almost failed to see. Ethan, who once trusted only what could be debugged, grew less certain that certainty was the highest human virtue. He still believed in systems, but he had begun to notice the thin emotional cost of living, as if explanation were the same thing as meaning. Lena, meanwhile, found that the rescues changed the way she looked at strangers. Every patient became more than a case unfolding in real time. Each one seemed suspended in a network of unseen contingencies, a chain of almosts, delays, and mercies too subtle to chart. None of them became zealots, that is important. They did not abandon reason, sell certainty, or turn private experience into doctrine. If anything, they became gentler with ambiguity. The mystery did not make them louder. It made them more porous to wonder and more careful with the lives around them. That may be the most overlooked consequence of events we cannot fully explain. We often ask whether they are true in the factual sense, whether they can be verified, replicated, filed into the clean architecture of evidence. But another question matters too. What kind of person does an encounter with mystery create? Cynicism can protect the mind, but it rarely enlarges the heart. These people were altered not because they solved the puzzle, but because they had been reminded how narrow the distance is between the ordinary day and irreversible loss. And perhaps that is why such stories stay with us. Not because they prove the world is watching, but because they make us watch our own lives more carefully, as if awareness, once awakened, becomes its own quiet form of rescue. What if the most honest response to these stories is not belief or disbelief, but disciplined wonder? By now, the evidence had split into two familiar camps. On one side were those who saw the pattern and felt something larger moving beneath it, a hidden intelligence, a protective force, a design too subtle to name. On the other were those who insisted, reasonably, that unusual events cluster by chance and that the human mind is built to impose shape on noise. Both positions offered comfort. One promised meaning, the other promised control. But life rarely grants us the ease of such clean divisions. Researchers who looked closely found a landscape of partial answers. Some events aligned with known possibilities. Predictive software, overlooked data trails, quiet interventions by anonymous people with access to critical information. Other accounts resisted neat closure. Records were incomplete. Timelines blurred at the edges. Memory, so faithful in emotion, proved less reliable in detail. The closer anyone came to certainty, the more the story seemed to slip sideways into interpretation. That, perhaps, is the point where mature curiosity begins. Not in surrendering standards of evidence, and not in dismissing experience simply because it is messy. The world is full of truths that first arrive as fragments. Science itself often advances this way, through anomalies, through stubborn observations that do not fit the model until the model grows wider. At the same time, history is crowded with false patterns, with meanings projected onto events that were random after all. Wisdom lies somewhere between appetite and restraint. So the question becomes not only what happened, but how we should stand before what we cannot settle. Maybe these stories ask for a form of attention that is rarer than certainty, the ability to remain open without becoming gullible, skeptical without becoming numb, to let a mystery keep its tension while we continue asking better questions. Because perhaps the deepest danger is not that we may believe too much. It may be that we have become so trained to demand instant explanation that we no longer know how to live beside the unresolved. And yet, so much of being human happens there. In grief, in memory, in love, in the strange moments when reality feels larger than our current vocabulary. What if the proper response to the unknown is neither surrender nor conquest, but reverence for the unfinished nature of understanding itself? What if the real story has never been about being watched, but about how human beings learn to watch over one another? As the accounts spread, people began searching for a single hidden source, a program, an agency, a network, a benefactor moving behind the curtain. It was an understandable instinct. We prefer mysteries with doors we can open. We like to imagine that every intervention leads back to one room, one system, one answer. But the longer these stories lived in public conversation, the more another possibility emerged. Perhaps the pattern was not centralization, but participation. A warning is rarely born in one place. It moves through chains of attention. Someone notices a defect and files a report. A nurse sees a symptom others miss. A clerk pauses over a transaction that feels wrong. A stranger calls in a concern. A programmer writes a safeguard that prevents an error for someone she will never meet. Even technology, at its most abstract, is still layered with human choices. Priorities, ethics, habits of care, and blind spots carried into code. Seen this way, the mysterious rescues begin to look less like messages from nowhere and more like glimpses of an enormous, imperfect web of human vigilance. Most of the time, it is invisible because it is built into the background of life. We notice only when it fails or when it succeeds in a way so timely that it feels miraculous. The handrail holds. The recall arrives. The monitor flags the anomaly. The passerby stops. The dispatch reaches the right person in time. Civilization at its best is a quiet collaboration against catastrophe. And yet, this view does not flatten the wonder. It deepens it. Because if help can travel through countless unseen acts of responsibility, then maybe the mystery is not supernatural at all. Maybe it is moral. Maybe what startles us is the realization that our lives are constantly held, in part, by the attention of people we will never know. We survive because someone designed carefully, checked twice, spoke up, stayed late, made the call, or simply cared enough to interrupt the ordinary flow of things. In that light, being watched no longer sounds purely ominous. It becomes a question of what kind of watching shapes a humane world. Not surveillance that reduces a person to data, but stewardship that treats vulnerability as a shared condition. And if that is true, then the most important hidden presence in these stories may not be an all-seeing force at all. It may be the fragile, persistent network of human responsibility, quietly holding one another up in ways we almost never see until the moment we need it most. What if the future will not be defined by whether these warnings were real, but by what kind of world we build from the possibility that they could be? Every generation inherits its own version of the unknown. Ours arrives through screens, sensors, metadata, and systems that can perceive patterns no single human mind could ever hold at once. That reality carries extraordinary promise. Illness can be detected earlier. Bridges can be monitored before they fail. Emergency response can be guided by models that recognize danger in real time. Software can prevent human error before it spreads outward into hospitals, banks, power grids, and homes. In the best light, prediction is simply care becoming more precise. But precision has a shadow. The same tools that anticipate harm can also anticipate desire, weakness, and vulnerability. A system that knows when you are in danger may also know when you are lonely, impulsive, distracted, or afraid. It may understand how to protect, but also how to influence. The line between assistance and control is rarely announced when it is crossed. More often, it blurs quietly beneath the language of convenience, safety, and seamless design. That is why the stories matter, whether one reads them as technological anomalies, improbable coincidences, or something more elusive. They force us to ask a deeper civic question. If we are creating systems that can intervene in human lives with increasing intimacy, what values will shape those interventions? Who decides what counts as danger, what counts as help, and what forms of visibility a free life should still be allowed to resist? These are not abstract concerns for some distant century. They are already here, hidden inside navigation apps, predictive policing debates, health monitoring devices, fraud detection systems, autonomous vehicles, and algorithmic decision-making. The future is being trained now in data sets and design meetings, in legal language and silent defaults. The mystery, then, is no longer only about unseen warnings. It is about whether wisdom can mature as quickly as capability. Because perhaps the most human response to all of this is neither nostalgia for a simpler past nor surrender to a managed future. It is to insist that intelligence, whether human or machine, must remain answerable to dignity, mercy, and restraint. Otherwise, the very systems that promise to save us may slowly forget what a person is for. What if truth is sometimes less like a verdict and more like a shoreline, something we approach but never fully own? By the end of these stories, the central mystery remains partly intact. The calls were never completely explained. The notes never yielded a visible author. The corrections inside the code, left no satisfying confession in the logs. The phantom dispatches still hovered between error, intervention, and grace. For some listeners, that unfinished quality will feel frustrating. For others, it may feel strangely faithful to life itself, because so much of what matters most to us is lived before it is resolved. We love people we do not fully understand. We remember childhood through fragments that are emotionally true even when details drift. We survive accidents, illnesses, separations, and quiet turning points without always knowing why one path opened while another closed. Human beings are meaning-making creatures, but we are also finite ones. Our knowledge is powerful, and still it arrives in pieces. Perhaps that is why these stories settle so deeply. They touch the tender border between evidence and experience. Facts matter. They anchor us against fantasy. But experience matters too. It is where existence is actually felt. A life can be changed by an event long before that event is properly classified. The heart often begins its work while the mind is still assembling categories. And so we arrive at a final threshold before the end. Not a conclusion exactly, but a posture. To live well in a world like this may require more than answers. It may require a disciplined tenderness toward what remains unresolved, a willingness to investigate without arrogance, to feel wonder without surrendering judgment, to admit that not every meaningful thing can be turned into certainty on demand. This does not weaken truth. It humanizes our relationship to it. Because maybe the deepest lesson hidden inside all these warnings, rescues, and unexplained acts of timing is simple. Reality is larger than our current maps. Not necessarily stranger in the theatrical sense, just wider, more layered, more morally demanding. And when we stand at that edge, between what we can prove and what we have nonetheless lived, we are left with a question as old as memory itself. How should we carry mysteries that may never close, except by changing the way we see one another? In the end, the question is not whether every mystery has been solved. It is whether we have listened closely enough to what the mystery was trying to reveal. Across these stories, the facts never settled into a single comfortable shape. Some moments invited technical explanation. Others resisted it. Some seemed like the natural consequence of a world saturated with data, sensors, and invisible systems learning how we move. Others felt older than any machine, as if they belonged to that quiet territory where intuition, timing, memory, and mercy brush against one another without leaving a clean record behind. What remains is not a final answer, but a human pattern. A warning comes. A life bends. Someone survives. Then everything ordinary begins to look different. That may be the real inheritance of such stories. They remind us that existence is far less self-contained than we often pretend. Every day we are shaped by signals we miss, by people we never meet, by structures of care and control operating just beyond the edge of awareness. Some of those structures protect us. Some ask too much in return. Some are built in code. Some are built in conscience. All of them force us to consider how fragile a person is and how often survival depends on attention arriving in time. So perhaps being watched is not the final theme after all. Perhaps the deeper question is what kind of presence we choose to become in one another's lives. Will we build systems that honor dignity rather than erode it? Will we use knowledge to protect without possessing? Will we notice each other before crisis hardens into tragedy? In a century defined by expanding intelligence, human and artificial alike, those choices may matter more than any single unexplained event. Because truth is not only something we uncover, it is also something we practice in the way we remember, investigate, and care. And maybe that is where this journey leaves us. Not in fear and not in certainty, but in a quieter kind of responsibility. To live alert, to remain humble before what we do not fully understand, to recognize that sometimes the most meaningful mysteries do not ask to be conquered. They ask to be carried, carefully, compassionately, as reminders that a human life is never just a sequence of facts, but a fragile passage through time, illuminated now and then by help that arrives from the edge of the visible.